Hello everyone and welcome back to Dorm Room Ventures. Today I'm joined by quite the distinguished guest, Professor Poff, who's a leader in entrepreneurship education and a mentor to countless student founders at Virginia Tech University. With decades of industry and teaching experience, now serving as the assistant department head and associate professor of practice at Virginia Tech, Ron helps bridge the gap between theory and practice, thus guiding students to turn bold ideas into sustainable ventures. From my experience as both a student and a founder, one of the biggest challenges that comes with starting an entrepreneurial venture in college is finding a way to balance everything. You got school, daily life, and now a startup, all the while staying sane. It's a lot. So, if you're struggling with this idea of balance, this episode is perfect for you. As in this episode, we'll be talking all about how students can pursue entrepreneurial endeavors sustainably and effectively, even amidst all the challenges of college life. All right, that's enough of my talk. Let's get straight into the episode. Hope you all enjoy. Well, Mr. Poff, thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, Zach. I'm looking forward to this. You have a wonderful program, and I'm just honored to be here.
That's really high praise coming from you. I really appreciate it. But yeah, so going into everything, per the title of this episode, and startups, school, and sanity, just the whole idea of finding balance within the whole myriad of tasks and responsibilities you have as a student, and on top of that, adding the idea of being a student founder or just generally being into entrepreneurship. I think this is a wonderful discussion. So it's great to have you here. And before hopping into the main gist of what we want to talk about here today, I want to hear a bit about you and your work. You obviously play a really big role here at Virginia Tech in the role in Department of Entrepreneurship. Can you tell us a little bit about that, what you do and how it intersects with entrepreneurship with students?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined Virginia Tech in 2017 as an adjunct faculty member. I'd been in industry for about 30 years at that point. So it was an opportunity in my time. I had been an entrepreneur, so product development, working with marketing and sales teams and engineering to find new products. And so it was a chance to come to a college campus and give back in ways of just sharing of experiences, sharing of network. Um, and really sort of helping students realize that there might be chances of failure through experimentation, but you can't fail unless you take initiative. And so really sort of helping them understand those moments in time of the when and the how, and also to sort of remove this sense of fear. I think having a community where failure is okay, I think, is important. And so really sort of building that sense of safe space along the way.
No, that's just so important because, in college in general, from the most minute details that college brings, like simply raising your hand to answer a question, we often feel punished for getting a question wrong or hence, failing in some regard. So I think it's so important that you bring that up, just the idea, failure is guaranteed on the track to success. So it's so important that we kind of embrace it and learn from it rather than, punish it or try our best to stay away from it. So going into, the whole idea about, the intersection of entrepreneurship as a student in college, I want to first kind of set the scene a little bit, kind of do a reality check on what it really means to be a student founder. Because when most students, and I was a victim to this, when students enter college and they want to become an entrepreneur or they want to start their own startup, they often think of images like, the social network, how Mark Zuckerberg was, trapped in his room with his small team and making a startup, and it was all the glamour and prestige. From your experience in working with student entrepreneurs, what do most students not expect when they start a business in college?
I think most students, and quite frankly, most entrepreneurs, is that it takes a lot of hard work and it doesn't happen overnight. And I think the other part is understanding that time of discovery takes time, and understanding what that problem looks like, who's the target audience. Historically, we all want things to happen as fast as possible. We want to be as rich as possible, or rich as fast as possible, because that's what we see. To your point, that's what we see in the media, social media kinds of things. And so I think it's the ability to say, It's going to take time. We need to kind of, understand that it's going to take people. We can't do everything ourselves, which I think a lot of times students feel that they could do that. I also think as I teach the first year experience class where, students come in, they were big stars in high school, a 4.9 on a 4.0 scale of GPA. Everything always had a place and everything was always successful. But what we realize in college that, now all of a sudden we don't have the same network that we did when we were at home. No one's waking us up, no one's making breakfast, no one's doing all of these things. And so there's this moment where we have to rely on our own, on ourselves that comes with that. Well, so do entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs have to rely on themselves to take the initiative and to network and to spend time, quality time, to get there. And so I think, one of the biggest things that I think students realize is that they need other people. They
Hmm.
need other expertise, experts and expertise and experience along the way. And that then opens up a sense of communication and a reach out. And I think for some of us, not just students, but just entrepreneurs in general, when we have to ask someone for something, then that could mean that we're inferior to that. Right. And so I think that, this moment of being comfortable with saying, I can't do it all, I need help is a big step with that. And so swallowing that pride and understanding what that looks like. And then I would also say is trying to find a mutual benefit. We want, at the end of the day, we don't want it to be a one-way street. There's wonderful streets out there that have signs of one way. We typically, most humans want it to be a mutual benefit, and so what type of reciprocity does that look like? I mean, it could come in many different forms of, equity or co-founder or roles, or, it's just, in some cases, maybe it's to build out a portfolio. But knowing what that is at the beginning, I think makes a big difference.
Hmm. And going into that idea of being with a team, what would you say to student founders? Because I hear this a lot. What would you say to student founders that rather would want to stay alone and work on their startup? Do you think that's feasible? Do you think that's something that they should stay away from?
Yeah. So I always think of it this way. No country can make everything they need on their own. They need other countries to help them. The same thing with entrepreneurs, which, obviously the resources are even more lean when it's just one person. Um, I mean, there could be certain exceptions out there. So I never want to say always or never, but in most cases, an entrepreneur needs help. And there's a whole conversation around opportunity cost and different things. And so I always think that entrepreneurs need to learn when they need to ask for help, how they ask for help, and what that looks like so that they don't burn themselves out. I mean, at the end of the day, if they try to do it all, I would argue it's going to take longer. It's not going to be as good as it could have been. Obviously the whole notion of diversity of thought and diversity of opinions and learned experiences. And so I think if an entrepreneur thinks that they can do it all themselves, it's a pretty selfish and self-centered approach to entrepreneurship.
No, perfect. And that kind of goes into my next point. Besides the common pitfall of students taking on just too much work leading to burnout, what are some other, major pitfalls that are common that lead student founders to a state of being overwhelmed or, like you mentioned, burnout?
Yeah, I think it's a matter, and kind of, it's kind of the bridge to the last point of, I think a lot of times they don't realize the resources that are available. Here at Virginia Tech, for example, we have the Apex Center for Entrepreneurs. We have the Corporate Research Center, which is just a couple of miles away. We have faculty, we have staff, we have alumni, we have other students, we have departmental classes and courses, and we have events. I mean, in and that's just here at Virginia Tech. I mean, if we were to drive 30 minutes to Roanoke, we have the Small Business Center, right? And so there are resources that I don't think students realize that are available. In many cases, they're paying for, let's be honest. Um, and so I think trying to introduce that to them as soon as possible. Then there's just the whole power of networking as well. So finding the right time, the right place, the right people, asking for introductions and not being ashamed or afraid to ask for introductions along the way, I think is important as well.
Definitely. And especially, like you mentioned that last point, networking, just because it's interesting. I actually mentioned this in my last episode with Carol Moxham, but in every single episode that I've had so far, the one and the only topic that has made sure to be discussed every single episode has been networking, and, for reasonable cause as well, just because it's so important, especially for student founders who really don't have a network built yet. And so this next question is actually, I was really excited for this one because I have a lot of personal experience with this in the whole space of analysis paralysis and everything like that. How would you define the difference between being busy and actually being productive?
Yeah. Yeah, it's one, if I'm honest, I have struggled with probably my entire life, where, we will roll up our sleeves, we'll put in as much time as possible, and yet we don't get the results that we expect, right? And so it was probably early in my career in product, and it was in product development, it was in the sourcing side. So trying to find the right partner to make products. And I kept saying, listen, I'm working 12 hours, 14-hour days, and I'm spending time away from my family. And finally, my boss said, listen, effort doesn't always equal results, right? And so, you have to be more efficient with the use of your time. And I'm like, okay, well, that's easier said than done, my friend, right? Kind of thing. But, once I started to reflect on that, it really made me step back and really understand what was I doing that was getting the most reward. But what was I doing that actually just was not working? I mean, I was hitting a wall every time. And how could I do that differently? And that could open up a whole nother conversation of whether it's leadership, delegation. Am I trying to do something that I could outsource to someone else? I think the whole point of it is having those moments of reflection and understanding that it's not necessarily the amount of time you're putting into it, but it's the quality that you're putting into that. And then secondly, having this understanding that you can't get it all done, and so you have to ask for help. I would also say, though, and you talked about, analysis by paralysis by analysis. So I think a lot of times entrepreneurs want to have perfection. We as humans, we want perfection. I mean, I
Hmm.
worked on this hair this morning to perfect it, right? And it's not perfect, but at some point, we have to go with what we have best. And sometimes that doesn't feel right, but that's the best we have. So I always think about, an MVP or the prototype and getting there. And at some time, they've got to be able to touch, feel, smell, taste this product. Well, if you get it to perfection, the competition's either going to go or the problem's going to go away, or you're just never going to get there. And so I think it's having those conversations and negotiations with yourself as to, what, this is the best we're going to go and the best we're going to get. And then we'll look at Rev 2 or Rev 3 or Rev 4.
100%. And that point is just so profound and important because, that immediately related personal experience in that regard, the idea of not being able to start lean and then pivoting, just because when I was working on a startup previously, our plan was essentially to build our MVP completely on our own, no feedback. And then from there, if we need to change, we need to change. But it was interesting because we actually talked to more experienced and veteran startup founders, and they mentioned their past failure in the idea of not being able to start literally as lean as possible and then taking stakeholder feedback from there and changing as they wish. Because at the end of the day, you might love your idea and you might think it's perfect, but those who actually are using your product, it may turn out they want something completely different. So next thing you know, you spent months, maybe a year building something and they don't even want that. So that's such an important point to all our listeners, that if you, there's one key takeaway, if you're building right now, make sure, like Professor Poff mentioned, always just auditing yourself and reflecting so that you can, one, avoid analysis paralysis, and also make sure that you're not in your own sort of tunnel vision of just pure working. So I think that's fantastic. Now that we've kind of you know cleared up what it really means to be a student founder and best practices, I want to really get into the whole idea of balance in college, because at the end of the day, that's what this whole episode's about. How can students choose a startup idea in the first place that fits their current time, energy, and capacity? Because I'm assuming there are different sort of niches and verticals you could go through that completely change how hard you have to work or who you have to work with. So do you have any sort of initial recommendations to balancing life in terms of what should students choose as an idea?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think we all have this debate of do we make a product first and have it out there in the field because it's something that we've thought about that's the next best thing, or do we focus on a problem that actually has is keeping people up or has an emotional connection to it. And so the way we teach entrepreneurship, or the way I tend to teach entrepreneurship, is really more about people and problems. And if we really stop and listen to classmates, roommates, suite mates, dining mates as students, you're going to hear problems. If we put our observational lens on and just walk on any college campus, where it's, whether it's here on our campus or any of the other campuses across the country, if you spend probably 15 to 20 minutes, you're probably going to find at least one problem, right? With that. And so I think if we're problem centric, then all of a sudden, this passion and purpose sort of blends together. And I think from an ideation standpoint, those become sort of obvious to us, right? I don't know that we can find a solution to everything in that regard, but that sort of seems to be the best thing. Now, with that being said, parking on college campuses was a problem 50 years ago, and it's probably going to be a problem 50 years from now, right? So there's some things that you have to, no pun intended, you have to park and lot and come back to later. But maybe it's homelessness in the same town that the college is in, or the bus routes and the bus timing, or is it looking at the restaurants that are off campus, and are they offering all the different food needs for all the different populations on camp? I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things. When I was in undergrad, it was about products, 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 and we're just going to push products. And if you build it, they'll come buy it. I think we've all learned, and actually Fortune 500 companies have learned that that doesn't work. We have to focus our limited time and our limited resources on what really truly problems are. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's interesting that, most campuses around this country have food deserts. Even though there's dining halls all over strategically placed, there are students that don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And that's a problem, right? Especially in an environment where college debt is out of control and these types of things. And so when a student can step back and realize that I know where my next meal's coming from, but my suite mate or my hall mate doesn't, why can't I try to solve that? Why can't I try to work towards that? So that is, again, right, wrong, or indifferent. That's sort of my focus, is really helping students. And what that does is it builds up observation skills. It builds up skills of empathy. It builds up skills of human-centric design and human-centric thinking, um, which at the end of the day, these are gaps, these are skills gaps that are in the market today. And these are what recruiters are looking for. So again, if you're going to start up, you're going to be your own boss, right? But many times that same mindset can be deployed in organizations, and in many cases, that's where even startups have to go, right, in order to
Mm-hmm.
get the capital and the experience along the way. So why not build up skills that actually people want and need? Um, there. I think the other great thing about these having the observational problem centric is that there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty with that. And ideation is all about that, is uncertainty and ambiguity. And so just trying to identify ways to mitigate that and open up those opportunities.
Yeah, and I love that point that you bring up about how, you know, what you learn and the skills you gain, even in the ideation stage alone, can be translated into the corporate world because so many entrepreneurs, and also those outside, think that these two spaces are so mutually exclusive, entrepreneurship and, the corporate side of things, but they really work together so beautifully. It's amazing. And focusing a little bit on that whole idea of, trying to find ideas wherever you can, become more observant of your environment and see the solutions, that are abundant. What I've noticed is that there are really two types of founders in the ideation phase. I tend to be the latter, but essentially there are those who any idea that they can get their hands on, they'll go ahead and pursue it super quickly. They'll say it's amazing, let's do it. And then there's the other, which, like I said, I usually fall down, where no matter what idea you get, you'll always find a way to kind of, be critical on it and, convince yourself that it's probably not the best idea. Do you think that these are both good mindsets to have? Is there one that's better? Or do you have any recommendations on the way you should think when you come with an idea?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I would say it's situational. I think there could be so many different things that impact that. Whether it's the environment, the time, the people that are around you, your own mindsets in that given time. Um, and so I think having actually utilizing both of them, but in different ways or different situations, could actually help in that. What I would say is I would be careful, or I would coach entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs to be careful being too self-critical. Yeah, I think we're always the hardest on ourselves. It's interesting. The guy that I brush my teeth with and shave every morning, me, I'm very, very tough on. Some days I deserve it, but most days I don't. And I think we also focus on many times the negative or the what if and contingencies versus what could be possible, right? So the glass is half full is the way we should enter in everything versus it's dark, cloudy, things are going to fail.
Fantastic. And, kind of touching back onto the whole idea of balance in this whole scheme, what are your best tips personally, both from your personal experiences and also observing students for balancing, internships, schoolwork,
Yeah.
startup, all these things simultaneously?
And that's, it's interesting because I get asked that quite a bit. And I would say everyone's different. I think it's important to recognize that we all come from different places, different learned experiences. And so I think that you sort of I want to be careful that there's not a template for everyone. But I do think because and last time I checked, I've asked for 30 hours, but for some reason the boss has only given me 24 hours, right? And I've been asking for an eighth day, but for some reason I'm only getting 7 days on my calendar. And so we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, I think, number one. Eating right, sleeping right, exercise, making sure that what goes in is healthy so that our being can be as positive as possible. I think the other part is surrounding yourself with positive people. Um, when we put good, positive people around us, they're going to be ones to help recognize when we need support, right? When we need extra help. And I think the third thing is it's okay to say no um, to things. Someone asks you to go out at 11 o'clock on a Monday night. It might sound good, but the answer might be, hey, not today, maybe another time, right? Because sleep is important and rest is important with that. The other thing, and this is easier for me to say than for me to practice, is it's okay to say no, right? We have to prioritize things. I love saying yes, because typically I enjoy doing things, but there's moments that we all should say no. And it's not because we don't want to, it's just that we don't have time to do everything that we want to do, I think there. And at the end of the day, so it just becomes prioritization. Let's be honest, CEOs of multi-billion dollar organizations have to prioritize because of people and resources. They have, even billion dollar companies have limited resources. They can't do it all. And I think we have to have that same mindset as entrepreneurs as to where and when we're going to do things along the way. And then the last thing I would say is celebrate the positives,
Mhm.
right? It is so easy in entrepreneurship to beat ourselves up, to find the failures, to look at things in a different way. Reflection and understanding where we need to make improvements, absolutely, we have to do that. But we have to do it in a honest, constructive, positive manner versus constantly beating ourselves up. We sort of started the conversation by saying it's okay to fail and that we want to have a safe space to fail, experimentation and iteration. Well, if we're going to believe that, then we need to make sure that we're not beating ourselves up when that does happen. And so it just leads me to say, celebrate the little things. There are moments that matter and celebrate those and then build upon them. So I've always talked about having a reflection journal. um, and reflections can come in many different ways. You could do a video reflection
Mhm.
every day if you wanted to. I always think that's kind of fun. You start out the semester with a video, and then you end and then kind of go back and watch the first 3 or 4 weeks of what that looked like. But anytime we reflect, it should be what went well. Always start out with that. And then what could have been done differently, not words of what failed, no, but what could have been done differently. And so when we start using language, positive language, then we start being more positive in who we are along the way. So I know it's kind of a long answer, and again, it doesn't solve everything, but I do think it's just treating ourselves with some humanity, right? And understanding that we can be very vulnerable if we beat ourselves up constantly. And quite frankly, what that does is it puts more fear for the next time that there's an opportunity, there's a problem to be solved. What do we do? Well, last time this happened, and so it's just not constructive.
Definitely. And I love that point that you bring up that you just mentioned that, how you talk to yourself directly affects how you see the outside world. I think that's so important and so overlooked. I think many students think that they can almost put on a facade of seeing everything with positive outlook, but at the same time, they're talking down on themselves. It goes kind of hand in hand. It's really important. And also the idea of priority. If there's one thing from my personal experience that, I'm so grateful for, and I actually did recently, was just literally write down what are my priorities with everything I'm working on. It was funny because I was having a call with one of your past students and also a previous guest on one of these episodes, Ben Morin, and I was just talking to him about everything I was working on. And I'm, going off on it for like 10 minutes. And he says, wait, hold on. Hold on. It really sounds like you don't have your priorities set. You really need to, like, let's sit down. Let's figure out how to manage these and going into work on it. And I bet, listeners, if you practice this sort of strategy as well as writing your priorities down, you'll realize just how much you didn't have organized and just how dangerous not having it organized could be in your everyday life. So I think that's a fantastic point. And so once students realize, okay, they need to find balance, they need to, find a way to manage all of these different things they're working on. Are there any resources you recommend that students may be overlooking? So mentors, incubators, things like that for their, I guess this is more yielded towards their startup in many ways, but also in another regard, just in general, balancing their lives. Are there any sort of resources you recommend for that as well?
Yeah, one of the things, and it's interesting because what I'm going to say is I'm going to enter in another element of time, but actually it could help them in the long run. And I think that's finding a community, whether that's a student organization, whether that's an entrepreneurship club, whether it's a faith-based group, but certainly finding a community, and it could be multiple areas of that of like-minded people that have similar values, similar drive, similar passion, where they could find an accountability partner or accountability partners, so that these are people that are living similarly, and so that they know what to see, things that they can point out to, the entrepreneur, the student, to work on. Because sometimes we need to hear what we don't want to hear, right?
Hmm.
Just like Ben saying, hey, Zachy, I think you got too many things going on here, right? And so having that community and then being willing to listen to feedback, I think, is important. Definitely. I mean, obviously, this is going to sound like professor speak and hokey dad speak, if you will. But certainly, I think students need to lean into and lean on their faculty even more than ever before. More than ever before. Um, Faculty have office hours, faculty have mentoring times, faculties have open doors. Faculty are members of the community, and most faculty, never say all, right? But most faculty really love that. They want to be a part of that. And what's happening is most students aren't taking advantage of that. I think they might email something, but walk into the faculty member's office, right? Schedule time, and get to know them and spend some time with that. And then obviously just trying to understand the resources on any campus of availability, and that can be from mental health, to gym and physical exercise. Um, Again, it could be, finding a group to go hiking with on a random, putting it on the calendar, and the second Sunday of every month, I'm going on a hike, right? And the third Saturday of every month, I'm going to go, and spend time at a specific brewery or something. Being intentional about those moments, I think, is critical, because this is actually what people do in industry. So they've spent that 5 years, 10 years sort of trying to figure themselves out. And where do they land? They land in trying to find things that make them happy, right? And finding that accountability partner at a gym, or finding that accountability partner at work, because we can't do that. We can't live this world on our own. As much as we would love to live this world on our own, we can't.
Hmm.
And that is the true part of entrepreneurship, is finding the right people, positive people, uplifting people, but people that hold us accountable to get things done, I think, is very, very important. One last thing I would say is, even be careful bringing people into your venture that you love the most, because
Hmm.
that might not be the best decision in the long run, right? That's a
Hmm.
whole nother conversation probably, but um, a lot of times it's nice to still have those people we love, but at arm's distance into the opportunities that we have. Because why do I say that? Because they're going to have a more objective view to help us and guide us along the way.
Definitely, very, very true. And I love that point that you bring up about, utilizing faculty as much as you can. I have my little notebook here that I little, scratch notes on whenever I'm in any episode in interviewing. And if there's anything that I learned that was so much different than my mindset of where I started this podcast in general, what I learned the most is just the idea of, making use of those who are more experienced than you. Mentors, faculty, department heads, whatever that may be,
Mhm.
adults in the industry, usually adults. There are also students that really have breaking into the industry that you're looking into. So it's just so important to make sure that you can make use of that, because they say you don't know what you don't know. So so you really need to make sure that you can highlight on those points, and have someone there that can kind of give you that insight into things that you simply don't know. And I think that's fantastic. So
And what I would say there too, Zachy, real quick, is that we all learn from one another. So yeah, I mean, I've been around a long time, but guess what? Every conversation I had, I mean, just before this podcast, I had a student here from industrial design, totally unrelated to business, right? But it's someone that I met a week ago. And so sure, I'm helping him, but during this last hour, I learned a lot from him. And so there's this mutual benefit, and so I get up every day excited to come in because I get to learn, right?
Hmm.
I'm a lifelong learner. And so I can learn as much from a 17 to 24-year-old as they can learn from me. It's a lot of fun, I think, in that regard.
Definitely, yeah. And actually, Ben Moore, he talked about this as well. That kind of resonates with your point as well. You know, there's mutual learning. It's not always you're learning from your mentor. The mentor is also learning from the mentee. I think that's fantastic. And so, kind of wrapping things up, you know, in the whole idea of just holistically balancing life on top of some sort of entrepreneurial venture, talking directly to our listeners, what's your advice for a student that's right now feeling, stretched too thin, but still committed to building something meaningful?
Mhm. Yeah, I think first off, if you're already working on something, you have taken a step larger than what most people don't. People that know me know that there's talkers and there's doers. And so at least you have taken the step to do something. So reward yourself, right? Give yourself some credit because most people stay in that talking mode for a long, long time. And so celebrate the fact that you had courage to take the initiative to get there. Number two would be sort of sit down and understand what's going well that you can continue to do well, but what are things that have sort of stalled or sort of having a hard time getting done? And then sort of look to see what could be outsourced. Who could you find to sort of fill that gap? And that could be a resource. It could be, again, this accountability partner. It could be a specific skill or gap to get there. And then the other thing would then just look at the calendar. Maybe this week, this month is not the right time. It's exams, finals. I've got to get my resume ready to get out for intern. So you know what? It's okay to pause, right? But build something on the calendar, very intentional, that you spend some time to say, okay, it's been a week, it's been 3 weeks, time to get back into it. I think that is incredibly important. And then if that cycle just continues to happen, hopefully you've put the right people, you've met the right situations, you've built a network around you that you can continue to go. That's wonderful. But if after a certain amount of time it is still idle, it's still stuck, might be time to say no and move to something else. And
Hmm.
guess what? That's okay, right? That's okay. You can always come back to it.
Oh, definitely. And I love the way that kind of this episode's wrapping up the same way it started, just being, okay with, having a few, setbacks at times. I don't want to call them failures, but just setbacks at times. And it's okay to kind of embrace them and learn from them rather than to beat yourself about them. I know, I wish I had this episode when I was in my freshman year of college. So I think it's a wonderful point. I think it's something that a lot of our listeners can benefit from because it's almost an epidemic nowadays, just the idea of being so hard on yourself, hustle culture, all these things. I think it's just so important that students know, take a step back.
Well, there's a couple of songs that come to mind. There's one right now, it's okay to not be okay.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think I think as human beings, I think we got to realize that. I mean, mental health is at the highest it's ever been. We got to take care of ourselves,
Mhm.
and it's okay to not be okay. And I think the second one, which leads to empathy, I believe, and I think that's who we should be as human beings, is just be humble and kind. Be humble and kind to ourselves and then to others. And if we are humble and kind, we're actually going to see problems through empathy and we're going to want to help. It's awesome because whenever we get on an airplane, right, they tell us to buckle our seats, get ready. But when those masks comes down, what do they tell us to do? Put it on ourselves first before we help other people. And so I think as leaders, as entrepreneurs, put that mask on first, make sure we're humble and kind to ourselves, and then we can actually help and move forward with other people. So,
Fantastic. I absolutely love that analogy. I've never heard that before. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, wrapping things up, Mr. Poff, where can listeners learn more from you or explore entrepreneurial resources in general at Virginia Tech?
yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's a couple of different ways. There's actually a textbook that I helped to write. It's a Foundations of Business textbook. It's free to anyone. So, Fundamentals of Business, fourth edition. It's a great textbook, especially for STEM majors, right? And so there's several chapters in there focused on entrepreneurship, focused on business, how to set up a business, et cetera, et cetera. There's actually a YouTube. I've got some videos out there. So if there's something that's not quite right, I've been using AI to create a podcast of the textbook.
Wow.
So there's that available too. And then obviously the Apex Center for Entrepreneurs. It is a wonderful resource that Virginia Tech has invested in. We've had a 10-year journey. The next 10 years will be even greater than the previous 10 years. The Department of Management within the Pamplin College of Business, we have a major, we have a minor, so students can look at that if they're interested. And then we have courses. So if you're in the College of Engineering, College of Science, Liberal Arts, anywhere on this campus, entrepreneurship can be for you. And so find those classes, find that minor. And at the end of the day, I'm in Pamplin. Reach out to me. I'll be glad to schedule some time and looking forward to future opportunities.
Perfect. Well, Mr. Poff, thank you so much once again. This was an absolutely insightful conversation. I know listeners are going to benefit from this.
More than welcome, Zachy. Take care. Good to see you.
All right, that's all for my discussion with Mr. Ron Poff. An incredibly insightful discussion at that. Hopefully, you all gained just as much insight and knowledge as I did. And before ending things for this week's episode, per usual, let's go over a few key takeaways that, if you don't remember anything from this episode, should be these. First off is the idea of knowing when to say no. As Mr. Poff mentioned, knowing when to say no is a key skill to knowing how to set priorities and thus balance a plethora of different responsibilities. If you say yes to everything simply for the sake of avoiding confrontation, you will be the one who suffers in the end. It's all about putting you and your goals first. The second takeaway is to celebrate the little things, right? When student founders focus on only these major milestones as they typically do, they completely overlook all of the amazing accomplishments they achieved along the way. As Mr. Poff mentioned, reflect often, and when you reflect, focus on, and I quote, what went well, and then what could have been done differently. Not what failed, but simply what could have been done differently. All right, that's all for this week's episode of Dorman Ventures. Stay tuned for next week, where I sit down with Chief Architect of AI Transformation at Microsoft, Kevin Tupper, and discuss how students and student founders alike can leverage generative AI to its max potential as we enter this new wave in emerging technology. All right, thank you all for listening, and until next time, this is Dorman Ventures.